Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. We're now on part 3 of the Jonestown and Jim Jones series. If you missed the first 2 parts, make sure to catch up. I've dropped the links in the description. Alright, let's get started. Remember Father Divine? We mentioned him in the last part. He was married to a Canadian woman named Edna, who took over his operations after his passing. 7 years later, Jim made his move to take control of Father Divine's congregation. He claimed that Father Divine's spirit had entered his body, and that he was now both Jim and Father Divine. Jim expected the congregation to follow him, but they weren't convinced, especially not Edna. She had been part of Father Divine's earlier scam and knew exactly what Jim was up to. Jim did manage to convince a few people to leave with him, but it wasn't much of a success. By this point, Jim had his inner circle of loyal followers, but he also had a smaller, tighter group called the Planning Commission. These were the people he trusted to carry out his dirty work. As the People's Temple grew to thousands, Jim needed spies to keep everyone in check, report any dissatisfaction, and make sure no one was thinking about leaving. California is where the People's Temple really took off, growing into a major political and social movement. Jim opened new locations in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and the timing couldn't have been better. In San Francisco, they set up in the Fillmore district, a mostly black, low-income area. The city had recently forced over 10,000 people, mainly poor and black, out of their homes through redevelopment, leaving them upset and abandoned. That's when Jim appeared, pretending to care and promising hope. As his influence grew, San Francisco's politicians began to take notice, recognizing the power of his loyal followers. However, rather than genuinely helping the people, the politicians saw them as a way to gain more power. Congressman Philip Burton introduced Jim Jones to George Moscone, who was running for mayor of San Francisco. Recognizing the power of Jim's growing influence, Moscone quickly saw an opportunity. Soon, 200 members of the People's Temple were fully involved in Moscone's campaign, working tirelessly to help him win. Jim even arranged buses to take his followers to the polls, making sure they voted. With Jim and the People's Temple's help, Moscone secured a victory in the election by 4,000 votes. Many believed that without Jim's help, Moscone wouldn't have won. The victory not only boosted Moscone's career but also inflated Jim's already enormous ego. He made sure Moscone knew exactly how much he had contributed to his success, never letting him forget the role he had played. With this victory, Jim gained even more power and influence in San Francisco, making his hold on the city even stronger. In October 1976, Moscone appointed Jim as chairman of the San Francisco Housing Committee. He used his position to place his loyal followers in key government roles, spreading his influence through the city's political system. By the time anyone figured out what was happening, it was already too late. Jim became known as someone who could manipulate elections, especially with Democrats. Politicians like Harvey Milk supported him, both publicly and privately. Harvey even warned people not to mess with the People's Temple, calling them weird and dangerous. Even though he sensed something wasn't right, he kept supporting him, probably because of the power Jim had over the city. Jim craved public attention. To boost his ego, he held a big banquet at the People's Temple and invited important people from San Francisco. Mayors, congressmen, lawyers, and other important figures all showed up. Willie Brown, who was an assemblyman at the time, introduced Jim as a combination of Martin Luther King, Angela Davis, and Albert Einstein. With so much power, Jim started to believe he could do anything. He started separating his followers from their families, even from others in the temple. He acted like an abusive partner, convincing members that their families didn't care about them, and only he truly loved and understood them. Jim took pleasure in humiliating people in front of everyone. He would make them stand up and tear into them, calling them useless, telling them they were nothing, and questioning why they were even there. It was the kind of abuse that left people in tears. As this was happening to the followers, Jim was thriving in San Francisco. He had control over politicians, socialized with the city's elite, and acted like a powerful, untouchable leader. But like everything else for Jim, his power began to fade, slowly, but steadily. The signs were there, and what seemed unbreakable started to fall apart. In 1972, the first negative press about the People's Temple surfaced. Lester Kinsolving, a religion editor for the San Francisco Examiner, wrote a series of 8 articles exposing Jim Jones. He accused Jim of abusing power, unethical behavior, stealing money, and exploiting people's faith. One of the most shocking claims was that Jim said he could raise the dead. Kinsolving also mentioned that Jim always had armed guards with him. Back then, with no social media, Jim couldn't send his followers to attack Kinsolving online. Instead, they flooded the Examiner with letters demanding the articles be retracted. Of the 8 articles, only 4 were published. It seemed like the Examiner faced pressure from both temple followers and Jim's powerful political connections. In 1973, the first group of members left the temple. 8 people wrote a letter explaining why they left. They criticized Jim's hypocrisy, pointing out how he preached equality but kept a mostly white inner circle. They also mentioned how favoritism was based on money. Those who brought in more had special treatment. Despite leaving, they didn't fully blame Jim. They mainly blamed his inner circle, accusing them of holding him back and maintaining a strict hierarchy. In the letter, they still praised Jim, saying he had inspired them and that he made them believe anything was possible. It was clear they were still afraid of him, or maybe still believed in him to some extent. Their departure caused chaos in the temple. People began gossiping, and Jim grew increasingly paranoid. He blamed his planning commission for not noticing the warning signs. Jim got really angry and demanded even more control over everyone. From then on, nothing could happen without the leadership knowing about it. Around this time, Jim started feeling that San Francisco, and maybe even the US, was no longer safe for him and his followers. The bad press and people leaving the temple made him paranoid. He decided they needed a new place, somewhere isolated where no one could bother them. He leased 3,800 acres of land in Guyana and began building what he called the Promised Land, which would later become known as Jonestown. He promised his followers a peaceful life, free from oppression and judgment, where they could work and live in harmony. He told them the bad press and conspiracy theories against the temple were attempts by the US government to destroy their vision of socialism. This helped him keep his followers loyal and motivated. For Guyana, welcoming the temple served a strategic purpose. The country, which had recently gained independence from Britain, was in a territorial dispute with Venezuela. They believed having Americans at the border would make Venezuela think twice about attacking, fearing the US might strike back. The temple acted as an unofficial human shield for Guyana. On August 1, 1977, a groundbreaking article written by Marshall Kilduff and Phil Tracy was published in New West magazine. With the help of 10 former temple members, the article exposed the abuse and corruption happening behind the scenes at Jim's church. It also called for an investigation into him and the temple. Just before the article was published, the magazine's editors reported a break-in at their office. The only thing disturbed was a file on their computer about the People's Temple. However, it turned out there was no break-in. A staff member had accidentally knocked into the computer while climbing through a window after borrowing keys. Still, the rumors of a possible break-in made people even more curious about the article. When the story was released, it attracted a lot of attention. Many politicians who once supported Jim distanced themselves from him, except for Willie Brown, who continued to stand by him. Meanwhile, the custody battle between Grace and Tim Stone over their son John Victor was gaining public attention. Tim was speaking out everywhere, making sure people knew what was happening. Knowing the article was about to drop, Jim quickly flew to Guyana, taking John Victor and about 1,000 of his followers with him. Jonestown wasn't ready for such a large group. It had taken 6 months just to build a road through the jungle, and there wasn't enough housing or food for everyone. Jim brought his children and his trusted assistant, Carolyn Layton, but left his wife, Marceline, in San Francisco to manage things there. At first, life in Jonestown seemed like a fresh start. People were excited about the idea of living in the jungle, working hard and growing their own food. While some found aspects of life there enjoyable, many were disappointed when they arrived to find a thick, hot, mosquito-filled jungle instead of the tropical paradise they had been promised. The settlement was overcrowded, with many people squeezed into tight spaces. Long lines for the bathroom were common, and the showers were basic outdoor setups. To make matters worse, the water wasn't safe to drink. Meanwhile, Jim enjoyed a spacious private cabin equipped with a refrigerator, a bed, a fan, and other comforts that he kept to himself, separate from the others. He lived there with Carolyn Layton and another woman, Maria Katsaris, along with John Victor Stowen. At the same time, his mindset began to shift. Jim grew increasingly paranoid, believing the U.S. government was coming after him. He had guns shipped secretly to Jonestown, using the code word Bibles to avoid raising suspicion. Things were getting tough financially. The U.S. Social Security Office stopped sending checks to elderly temple members, which was a major source of income for Jonestown. It cost $600,000 a month to run, and Jim's plans weren't working. As a result, the atmosphere in the settlement began to change. When new people arrived, their luggage was searched, and anything valuable, like jewelry or money, was taken and sold. The punishments in Jonestown got more severe and cruel. They had a punishment system called the box, an isolation chamber used for people who misbehaved. They also dug a pit in the ground to throw people in. Public humiliation got even worse. One woman, who was terrified of snakes, was forced to hold an anaconda. Her hands shook as the snake wrapped around her and she was terrified. But instead of helping her, everyone just laughed and made fun of her fear. At night, the meetings would go on for hours. People worked all day starting at 6 a.m., and then had to sit through these long, exhausting meetings. During the meetings, Jim would read fake stories from U.S. newspapers, claiming that the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist group, had taken over. He would tell them that children were wearing white hoods and black people were being sent to concentration camps. To make sure his followers stayed convinced, Jim continued to manipulate their perception of the world. Occasionally, representatives from the Guyanese government would visit to check on things. However, Jim carefully staged these visits to create the illusion of order and peace, despite the chaotic reality behind the scenes. He carefully staged everything for the officials, showing off the best parts of Jonestown. He had rehearsed members speak positively and treated the visitors to lavish meals, even though most of the community was hungry. However, Jim treated visits from the U.S. Embassy very differently. He viewed them as the enemy. By late 1977, families in the U.S. had flooded the State Department with letters and calls, worried about their loved ones in Jonestown. As U.S. officials started visiting more often, Jim claimed it was all religious discrimination. He even threatened lawsuits, saying they wanted to practice their faith. Eventually, the U.S. and Guyanese governments started backing off, deciding it wasn't worth the conflict. However, Leo Ryan wasn't convinced. He didn't believe that everyone in Jonestown was there willingly. After talking to former members, he became determined to investigate. The stories he heard didn't match the perfect image Jim portrayed. Ryan decided to visit Jonestown himself to see if people needed help. As Jim's fear and distrust grew, he began making plans for what he called the final White Night. These White Nights were practice drills for mass suicide, repeated 82 times over a year. Jim began introducing the idea subtly, often hinting at the possibility, suggesting that dying might be better than letting outsiders take their children. Over time, the rehearsals became more extreme. During these drills, Jim would bring out containers of red liquid and tell the group it was poison. He told them it would take only 45 minutes for all of them to die, using these moments to create fear and test their loyalty. Many of Jim's followers from California had already experienced the poison drills, so when they drank the red liquid during this latest drill, most assumed it was another test. Afterward, Jim revealed it was merely a loyalty test and praised them for passing. As a reward, he announced they could take the rest of the day off. The group, drained and confused, sat in stunned silence, struggling to process what had happened. The next morning, Jim handed out paper and asked everyone to write about how they would have felt if this had been the actual White Night. Soon after, Jim instructed Larry to purchase a pound of cyanide for $8.85, enough to prepare 1,800 lethal doses. Although the plan was becoming more evident, Jim still did not disclose his true intentions to his followers. Instead, he continued to claim that negotiations were ongoing with Russia to relocate the group there. He described the White Night as merely a backup plan, despite the fact that Russia had no interest in hosting them. While Jim kept his followers distracted with false hopes, Tim Stowen continued his legal battle against the temple. Determined to fight, Tim filed one lawsuit after another, refusing to back down. Meanwhile, Jim found himself trapped. unable to return to the United States without facing arrest and knowing that ignoring the lawsuits would also result in a warrant. His options were running out, and the pressure was mounting. Before Leo Ryan even arrived in Jonestown, Jim was already planting seeds of fear and paranoia among his followers. He told them Ryan was sneaking around at night, planning to destroy their community. Jim painted Ryan and his group as enemies, calling them names like communists and degenerates and accusing them of being against Christ. He even suggested that if it came to it, they might have to kill Ryan, or even children, to protect their way of life. On November 14, 1978, Ryan arrived in Georgetown with his team, which included staff, reporters, and relatives of Jonestown members. The U.S. Embassy told Ryan he was on his own, and the Guyanese government didn't want to get involved either. They'd already investigated and found nothing wrong, and didn't want to risk a lawsuit for religious discrimination. Jim initially refused to let Ryan visit, especially after hearing he brought defectors and reporters. But Marceline, frustrated, urged him to allow it, arguing it was better to let people leave peacefully. Her words worked, and Jim reluctantly agreed. When Ryan and his group arrived in Jonestown, they interviewed residents who mostly claimed to be happy. That night, Jonestown held a feast filled with singing and dancing to show outsiders how happy life was in the community. During the event, Vernon Gosney secretly slipped a note to NBC reporter Don Harris, pleading for help to escape. When Harris accidentally dropped the note, a nearby boy spotted it and raised the alarm. Vernon quickly picked it up and handed it back, pretending it had been dropped by mistake, but he was terrified, knowing the danger they now faced. Later that night, as tension grew, 11 residents made a daring escape, slipping through the jungle under cover of darkness. The next morning, Marceline gave the press a tour of the compound, showcasing the facilities to create the impression of a thriving community. Meanwhile, Ryan and his assistant, Jackie Spire, met with residents who wanted to leave and recorded their statements. Jim, visibly furious after hearing about the escape, finally showed up and was confronted by Ryan about the note and others wanting to leave. Although Jim insisted people were free to go, it was clear he was losing control. More residents stepped forward to leave, sparking anger among Jim's loyal followers, who began shouting and threatening the defectors. The situation was rapidly unraveling, and Jonestown was on the brink of chaos. The next day, 15 more people joined the escapees, and Jim's lawyers tried to downplay the situation. But Jim was increasingly worried. As the defectors prepared to leave, Larry joined them, which raised suspicions. However, they didn't pay much attention to it and began their long, difficult journey to the airstrip. Soon after, a truck with armed men headed toward the airstrip to stop the group. At the airstrip, 2 planes were ready, but not everyone could fit, creating tension among the defectors and media. Larry's true intentions were soon revealed. He had planned to kill the pilot mid-flight, ensuring everyone would die. As the group argued over who would board the planes, the truck carrying the armed men arrived, and they immediately opened fire. Amid the chaos, Larry pulled out his gun and started shooting as well. People scrambled for cover, some running into the woods and others hiding behind the planes. Those who couldn't escape were caught in the gunfire. When the shooting stopped, the aftermath was horrifying. 5 people were dead, including Leo Ryan. Jackie Spire was critically injured but still alive. The planes meant to save them took off, leaving the dead, the injured, and the survivors stranded on the airstrip. It was too dangerous for rescue teams to arrive at night, so the survivors were left to tend to the wounded and wait for help. Back at Jonestown, Jim called everyone to the pavilion for a meeting. Jim frantically tried to justify what was about to happen, warning his followers that once news of the killings at the airstrip reached the outside world, outsiders would invade Jonestown. He painted a grim picture, claiming they would come armed, take their children, and kill everyone. He urged them to act quickly, insisting it was better to end their lives on their terms rather than face destruction at the hands of others. Initially, many believed this was just another rehearsal, similar to the numerous white nights they had endured, where Jim had tested their loyalty through staged mass suicide drills. Doubt began to spread when someone in the crowd questioned why they weren't planning to flee to Russia as Jim had previously suggested. He dismissed the idea, declaring that it was no longer an option given the circumstances. Another voice from the crowd pleaded for hope, arguing that as long as they were alive, there was still a chance for survival. Jim, however, ignored the plea and continued pushing forward with his plan. Soon, nurses appeared with syringes and barrels of poisonous liquid. Jim announced that the children would be the first to go, and that parents who wished to die alongside their children could join them. Panic spread through the crowd as people cried, screamed, and begged for it all to stop. Jim refused to listen, insisting it had to be done and urging those who hesitated to drink the poison. He showed no mercy, pushing others to force those who resisted. What had started as a choice had turned into a horrifying act of mass murder planned by Jim. Marceline made one last attempt to stop him, begging him to end the killings. However, her resistance was met with indifference. Jim coldly informed her that her children were either already dead or soon would be, leaving her with no reason to continue living. Armed guards surrounded the pavilion, ensuring no one could escape or resist. The children were the first to die, their agonizing deaths confirming the grim reality of the situation. Adults were forced to follow, some still clinging to their misplaced trust in Jim, while others, overwhelmed by fear and despair, saw no way out. Those who resisted were forcibly injected with the poison, and chaos consumed the pavilion as hundreds perished. Throughout the massacre, Jim continued to speak, occasionally pausing to give orders or pressure others to comply. By the end, over 900 people, including children, had lost their lives. Jim did not take the poison himself. Instead, he died from a gunshot wound, though it remains unclear whether it was self-inflicted or if one of his guards fired the shot. Among the first to die was 6-year-old John Victor Stowen, whose parents Tim and Grace Stowen had fought relentlessly to save him. Despite their efforts, they were unable to protect him. He was one of many innocent victims lost in this senseless and tragic event. What do you think led so many people to follow Jim Jones so blindly? Could more lives have been saved if authorities had acted sooner? How can we learn from this tragedy to prevent similar events in the future? Share your thoughts and comment below. Thank you so much for watching the entire Jonestown series. I hope it helped shed light on the tragic events that unfolded there. I'm excited to let you know that my next video series will be about the Manson family, another dark chapter in history. Subscribe and press the bell icon so you don't miss it. Thank you so much for your support. It really means a lot.